Well, hello everybody. My name is Daniel Abrams. I'm with the State Water Survey, the Groundwater Flow Modeler. And what I want to talk about today is the Sandstone Aquifer in McHenry County. There's a few things I want to get into. First, I want to talk about a little bit about background of where I work at the Illinois State Water Survey. I then want to dive into the sandstone and focus on two things specifically. One is the sustainability of this aquifer, and the other is whether or not it is at risk. After that, I want to talk about the implications of this for water supply planning. And finally, I want to talk about some recommendations for next steps. So the water survey is down in Champaign, Illinois, very small building that we work out of out there. And we look at water issues throughout the state of Illinois. One of the major ways that we do that is we go around and meet with communities. This image here shows where we're meeting with communities and industries down in Will County about many of the same issues I'm going to talk about today, the sandstone. That's one important way we collect information. Another important way we collect information is we collect water quality samples and we collect water levels throughout the state. We don't just look at groundwater. There's a group at the Water Survey down in Champaign who also looks at atmospheric science, looks at river levels, and all of this information is important. Such as right now, when giving this presentation, McHenry County is in a severe drought. All of this information we take back in teams and develop groundwater flow models to help understand issues throughout the state and cycle that information back, and it's a continuous loop, meeting with communities, collecting data, and developing models. We don't do this alone. We work with a lot of different entities. We work closely with IDNR, Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Office of Water Resources, who assess statewide issues, particularly focused on sustainability. We also work with regional groups. An important one for McHenry County is the Northwest Water Planning Alliance. And then we work closely with local stakeholders, including county level and municipal level stakeholders to address these issues. The issue we're talking about today is the sandstone. The Water Survey's been looking at this for over 100 years. It's a cyclical process that we keep going through that I'll explain. But at this point, I think it's time to call it that the Sandstone Aquifer is dying. And I'll explain what I mean as we go through this presentation. The important thing to understand about the sandstone in McHenry County, in the northwest portion of this cross-section, what you have is actually the southeastern corner of McHenry County. That is where the sandstone is most heavily utilized. And so imagine you're standing there. What's beneath your feet? Well, the first thing you see is unconsolidated material. That can be a mixture of clays or sands. You go deeper and you get into bedrock. The first couple of layers, you see they're colored gray. Well, they're going to impede flow. In Amy's previous presentation, she talked about confining layers. These are confining layers that act as lids over the top of the sandstone aquifer. The sandstone aquifers are in blue. The two that are readily utilized in McHenry County are the St. Peter and the Ironton-Garrelsville. The Mount Simon has a higher salinity, so it isn't used as very much in this county. So that is the issue that we have. These aquifers are deep, and they're covered by confining layers that impede the movement of water. Very little gets in, particularly when compared to what's being removed from the sandstone. This plot here, if you look at the top of the pink line, the pink area, that represents how much water is being withdrawn, the sum total. Within that, there's two portions. There's the blue portion. That's coming from pretty fresh recharge. That's making it through the confining layers. They're semi-confining. They allow a little bit of water to leak through. Actually, they allow 40% of the water that Northeast Illinois uses to leak through. That may actually surprise you how large that number actually is. But 60% of the withdrawals, what you see in pink right now, are unsustainable. They're not making it through to the sandstone. When you go to McHenry County, we just saw a cross-section that showed all of those aquatards, another term for confining layers. But when you sum up the total of what's coming in to the sandstone in McHenry County, and you compare it to the demands, so the demands here are in blue, and the supply is in orange, supply is much greater. We have more water coming in McHenry County to the sandstone, this is a sandstone-specific plot, than we have being removed. That might surprise you. We'll talk about why that is. But don't necessarily think this means everything is okay. Because as you focus in different areas, you find different stories. In that southeastern portion of McHenry County, where a lot of the demands are, wells are often completed only into the deeper Ironton-Gallsville. That deeper aquifer that you saw in that earlier cross-section. It means water has to infiltrate that much farther to get to them. And when we start looking at available supply that can get there, it's a very small number. So yes, on total, water's coming into the county, but it's not always coming in where we need it. And so this plot shows you what this looks like in plan view. Everywhere you see blue is where the confining layers are either absent or they're allowing enough movement in to get a considerable amount of water. That's why we have water coming in McHenry County. But look at where the demands are. They don't match with where the water is entering with those blue areas. And that leads to some complications. What are those complications? Let's simply, in those areas, withdrawals exceed the supply, what's coming in, and water levels drop, and they continue to drop, and they continue to drop. Now, these deep aquifers are under pressure when they were first drilled, like a can of soda that you shake up and open up, and water or soda comes flying out. But it only comes out for so long before all that pressure is bled off. We're dealing with something similar here. All those withdrawals are reducing that pressure until eventually water levels fall into the sandstone. And this is where problems start. It's not that the wells go dry. It's that they start to dewater the formation, and that leads to a number of issues. The most prominent is that water was holding that sandstone together. As the water levels fall, the sandstone's pretty pliable, it caves, and that sand gets pumped up, moved through the pump. Sand through machinery is not a good thing, and that creates problems, and that's why a lot of wells are no longer even open to the uppermost St. Peter, even in McHenry County, because this has either been an issue or it's an issue that people are trying to avoid, and rightfully so. That's expensive to handle. So that's the issue we deal with, that when a sandstone dewaters, when it desaturates, those two terms are synonymous, that's when the issues manifest, not when the aquifer goes dry. So this has been something that we've been building our knowledge on for 30 years before I was born, going back into the 1950s, where the Water Survey noted water levels are falling, and they're falling fast. We communicate that information to communities. We get the question back, okay, well, how long can I stay on the aquifer? It's a very logical question. There's some discussion back and forth, but eventually a community realizes this needs a change, this needs to stop, we need to get off, and generally the choice is to go to Lake Michigan. An assumption's often made at this point. Has the issue now been resolved? Kind of seems like it. Water levels went up, and there's a temporary pause. We go back 20, 30 years, and the cycle starts again. This happened in the 50s, went through in the 80s. We're going through it now in the southeastern suburbs of Chicago. And you see it in this plot. The darker blues in here represent later and later years that communities switched away from the sandstone at some point in time, and it's been a slow transition creeping out, but there are still communities now who are looking at making this switch. This isn't an issue that's been resolved. The newest one right now is in the southeastern suburbs. As many of you are probably aware, if you've been looking at the news, is that Joliet, in those southeastern suburbs, a major water user. They use more water than McHenry County total. They're leaving the aquifer in the year 2030, is the current plan to go to Lake Michigan. So this question needs evaluated, but we want to get ahead of 20 to 30 years. We want to try to understand if this issue is happening in the very near future. So here's a result from our model. The first plot shows what risk looks like right now with Joliet on the aquifer, everybody else pumping what they pump now. Everywhere in orange represents where water levels are 400 to 600 feet above the top of the Ironton-Gellsville. That may sound like a lot, who cares? You turn on some of these wells though, they can have 2, 3, and even 400 feet of drawdown. So these are when the wells aren't pumping that we're looking at. When those wells are pumping, you get 200, 300, 400 feet of drawdown. You're getting really close to the top of the Ironton-Gellsville, whereas we discussed earlier, that's when issues would start to manifest. That's what we look like now. Now, if we jump forward in time to 2050, what's pumpage going to be? We have to run scenarios. We don't know what that's going to be. You don't want to just run a single number. So we run a low growth and a higher growth, a current trend scenario. And you can see the results are, the risk is still there. And if you look in McHenry County, which I think is what a lot of you are going to be interested in, you're going to see that, well, it depends. If we go with the lower growth scenario, actually demands didn't change that much. They actually went down a little bit due to water conservation, due to some communities nearby switching off in Lake County in this scenario. And you even get a little bit of recovery in places and a little bit more drawdown in others, but the general pattern between 2020 and low growth looks similar. But if you look at the current trend, that's just 2 MGD more, 2 million gallons a day more. That really starts to look different. We're now getting those pockets of red. What does the red mean? Well, it means we're within 400 feet. Remember I mentioned wells can have 400 feet of drawdown in the sandstone. They don't always, but they can. And that's where the concern starts to come in, and we start to see some pockets popping up in the year 2050. Just want to go back to this to remind geology matters. It's no coincidence that where we see the risk manifesting not only is where the demands are, but it's where the water is not coming into the aquifer. That's more so in the western part of the county, and our drawdown is in that southeastern corner. It's an unfortunate reality. Don't be distracted by the cat licking. It's trying to get water deeper and deeper and deeper, right? That's the analogy here. But it's an unfortunate reality that Joliet switching off of the Sandstone Aquifer is not going to resolve these issues for anybody. That's the same thing that we found out for communities in Will County. So of course that's going to hold true as we move north. At what point will water levels have fallen too far? We need to begin to understand future withdrawal. I mentioned this earlier. Here's just 3 scenarios from an old study just to give you a feel of the range of total demands that have been simulated in the past in McHenry County. Which of these is most realistic? That's not something I'm able to answer, but this is a range of scenarios that we've seen that have been played out in past water demand future scenarios. Okay, that's often just assuming municipal growth, but what about industry? All the risk plots I showed you earlier, those orange and red plots, we're just looking at community growth and assuming no industry growth. So what if a new industry comes in? What if it's a data center? I realize that's been in the news recently. What if a data center comes in? Data centers use quite a bit of water. Where will that come in? How much will it use? That's going to matter. Another important one, and Amy's presentation discussed many of the issues related with these shallow, unconfined aquifers and vulnerability to contamination. If that persists and reaches a point that communities need to consider alternative sources, we've seen throughout Northeast Illinois, that alternative source is often the deep aquifer. This deep, unsustainable, at-risk aquifer we've been talking about is often viewed as a preferable alternative when water quality becomes a concern. In McHenry County, where more than 2/3 of the demands are using the shallow aquifer, about 1/3 using the sandstone. When we develop our models, we take whatever distribution and we just scale it as it is now between the shallow and the deep. But if things change, if the proportion changes, and suddenly we go to a 50-50 split between shallow and deep because there's choices made to add more deep wells rather than shallow, that changes all of this story. That changes how we perceive risk in this system. And it's a balancing act that all communities now have to face, balancing the unsustainability of the deep aquifer and the threats to shallow water quality, or in some cases, isolated, but there are issues with quantity, supply as well that at least need to be weighed when considering, will the next well that we drill be shallow or deep? And there's other details. I don't want to get too much into this. Just briefly to say, this plot shows that as water levels fall through time, often wells become less productive. It means they have more drawdown when they're turned on, and that drives them closer and closer to at-risk levels. This decrease in productivity often can accelerate how quickly a community approaches the end of the life. Remember, we're talking about a dying sandstone aquifer. It helps assess how close communities, how soon communities reach the end of their life. This is the kind of detail that you might not think about. It's not pumping, but it matters when making these assessments. So we're obviously on a clock. Is that 30 years? Is it 100 years? There's a lot of uncertainty in that. And I generally don't recommend using a single value estimate to define that uncertainty. I think it's important to take the time to understand what different water supply planning initiatives could lead to. That's where collaboration comes in. We've been working closely with communities in the southwestern suburbs to head on this issue that's there. This is going to manifest in the next 10 years for many of them, and we're working closely with them to help address that. And also data. We need the data. All the data that you've seen in earlier presentations, in this presentation, is essential to telling this story and understanding the fate of the aquifer. So in summary, there are pockets in McHenry County where certainly demand exceeds supply. That's led to risk, particularly when we run the models out into the future, but that's, of course, uncertain on when and where that would manifest. The clock is ticking, and the variables need explored here to define when, and that's where collaboration is key. So I want to close with some recommendations here. The first, for any water operators out there, annually send your static and pumping water levels to the Illinois Water Inventory Program at the Illinois State Water Survey. This is critical information that we need to understand this. Continue and expand monitoring as much as possible. That's a recommendation. All of the data that you saw earlier in earlier presentations, all of that is help feeding into this story, because the sandstone and the shallow aquifer are not two separate things. They have to be considered in tandem when doing water supply planning. And that planning needs to have collaboration at all levels, including scientists, including elected officials, public works directors, the state IDNR. Having all of these folks involved is critical to being able to make the right decisions. Unfortunately, that costs money. We continue to search for avenues to fund this work in northeastern Illinois and in McHenry County. We have a couple of proposals that are out there, and we continue and invite you all to share any ideas for developing collaboration or for funding initiatives or what have you. We certainly invite you to contact us to explore those, and there's my contact information. Please let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. Happy to talk about all this. I'm just going to close by saying it's not, despite the tone, despite everything I presented, it's not time to hit the red panic button yet. But it's time to look at the data. It's time to take a close look at what your neighbors are going to do and thinking about what those implications are. Thank you.